First of all, it's been a while since we didn't talk. It's been a while since I haven't written any article about your research. The last time I published a feature about your work in Wadi Feynan was a year ago, and you tackled metallurgy during Ayoubid-Mamluk time in Wadi Feynan. So we can start from Hirbet Nukaib in Islamic metallurgy period, or actually to be more precise, it's the middle Islamic metallurgy in Feynan. What can you say about metallurgy during that period? How developed it was, and what was the impact of Wadi Feynan in the middle Islamic period?
So, yeah, quite a lot. The People of Samar is sort of an interesting site. When we started investigating it, we weren't exactly sure what the date would be. And since we've been working on it for probably about, almost 10 years now, and we've been excavating there since 2011, 2012, we've discovered that we kind of had this idea that it would span most of the Middle Islamic period, basically that period from about 1000 to 1400 AD. And what we actually discovered in the excavations is a much, much shorter range of occupation. Most of our surface material had dated to the early 13th century, and that's all there is at the site. It's entirely an Ayyubid site, actually. And so there's other Middle Islamic occupation in Feynan, but the metallurgy seems to be limited to this really specific slice of time. And we kind of tried to figure out why that would be the case. Why basically somebody would come into Feynan after 600 or 700 years of nobody doing any metallurgy there. The Roman metallurgy stops probably in the 5th, maybe if you're really generous, the 6th century. And then nothing happens again until the early 13th century. And they're not producing all that much metal in the grand scheme of things. Between the couple of Middle Islamic metal production sites in Feynan, we have maybe evidence of the production of 100 tons, a little bit more than 100 tons of copper, which isn't nothing, but in the Roman period, we're talking about tens of thousands of tons. In the Iron Age, we're talking about probably tens of thousands of tons again. So 100 tons is not very much. But the metallurgy is pretty developed. They're working with a really difficult copper deposit. In most of Feynan, what you get are copper deposits that are mixed with manganese ore. And that's actually pretty nice to work with if you're a copper smelter, because manganese acts as a flux. It melts and kind of attracts a lot of the stuff in the copper that you don't want to end up in the final copper, and make sure it falls out into the slag instead. In the Middle Islamic period, it seems that the miners at Naqib al-Samar are working with a deposit where that manganese is replaced with iron. And iron is comparatively kind of a pain. It doesn't act as a flux. It actually forms a basically useless alloy of copper and iron. And so they had to do a lot of work refining that material. It probably wasn't a very difficult deposit, or was a very difficult deposit to work with. And so it raises the question of why they're doing all of that. Why go to the trouble of coming into Feynan, building a new village basically from scratch? We had no evidence of earlier occupation at the site either, to produce, in the end, not very much copper over about 50 years. That's where I've come up with this idea that probably what this is related to is the simultaneous expansion of sugar production in the Jordan Valley and the lowlands around the Dead Sea, basically kind of related to the work that Dina Politis is doing at Safi, and that a lot of people have been doing in the Jordan Valley at sites like Tel Abu Sarut and those places around kind of Deir Allah.
So what's the connection between the sugar industry, which flourished during Ayoubid-Mamluk period, and revival of copper production in Wadi Feynan.
Right. The connection is basically that sugar production, at least sugar production in the period that we're talking about, required the use of copper for cauldrons for boiling the cane juice in. Later, it's actually discovered during the colonial period that you don't exactly need to do this in copper, especially in the Caribbean in like the 18th and 19th century. There's a shift toward iron cauldrons that do the same thing. Although actually in English, the connection to these being copper is so strong that they continue to call them coppers even after they're made of iron, which is kind of, I think, a funny thing anyway. Although not a very funny industry in the end. But we actually have some, medieval texts, especially from An-Nuwairi, who describes this process in Egypt and basically lays out the amount of copper that you would need in every one of these factories. And the process kind of works where you've got your fields of cane sugar, and when the cane is harvested, you have a relatively limited amount of time before you have to crush it and get the juice out of it, because the cane starts to rot really quickly. And so we've got some spatial constraints on how far away your sugar factory can be from where you are actually growing sugar. It's really not that far, especially if you don't have a car or a truck, which, in the 13th century, most people didn't. Once you do that, you kind of crush them on a big stone, you get this cane juice, and it goes through an initial boil. What that vessel is, that might be a vessel made of ceramic, it might be a vessel made of copper. It seems that could have been a couple of things. But it's sort of the secondary phase where you're boiling the cane juice, and it's kind of the phase immediately before you put it in the ceramic cones and the ceramic jars to collect the molasses and the cone of sugar. At that phase, you pretty much need to be boiling it in these copper vessels. In Arabic, they're called desut, which I think just means like cauldron, basically, or cauldrons. And every sugar factory needed basically 8 of these, or 8 boiling installations for every stone that it had. You could have needed about this many to process the amount of cane that roughly one standard sized cone would have given you. And based on Dina's work in Gorsafi, we actually have a pretty good estimate of how big these things are. They have an example of one of these cauldrons that they actually found. I think somebody found it in the middle of a field in the 80s. And it's about 1 meter in diameter and weighs something like 150 or 250 kilograms. And so you need a bunch of these at every production site. At Tohina Sukar in Horsafi, there's actually evidence for 3 millstones, 2 maybe active in the same period, but 3 in total, which tells us they needed dozens of these cauldrons, each of which, we're talking about 150 to 250 kilograms of copper. And one thing that I kind of initially found really attractive about this proposal is, obviously this is really quick and dirty math. We don't have a great way of calculating this because we're not 100% sure how many sugar factories actually would have been active in the early 13th century. So few of them have been excavated. But if you're being pretty restrictive about what you're classifying as a sugar factory, so you're not including things that are obviously Ottoman flour mills and stuff like that, and you calculate based on Nuwairi's estimates of how many cauldrons you would need, about the amount of copper that the industry would have needed just to initially get enough cauldrons, the amount of copper that Andreas Hauptmann estimated was produced in the Middle Islamic period in Feynan is not much higher than that. It's maybe 10 or 15 tons over what was needed for the sugar industry. And so it's a pretty good match. And there are some political, economic reasons that it might have been beneficial to do this as well. I don't know if you want to
Go ahead,
to talk about that or have me go into it now.
it will be my second question, and actually, I wanted you to comment the notion of Donald Whitecomb, which is 20 years old, about the correlation between cultural change and political change. How cultural changes affect political changes in case of Feynan copper production.
That's actually a really good question too. So actually, in that case, yeah, maybe I'll address that first, and we can kind of come back to the issue of political economy by itself. I've pretty much adopted Don's periodization for the Islamic periods in a lot of my own work. I think as archaeologists working on the Islamic period in Jordan, a lot of us have kind of gone back and forth on this. So I know Bethany Walker and Sten LaBianca adopted that periodization for their work at Hispan, but they've also kind of gone back and forth between using those sort of archaeological labels, Don called them, and using the dynastic labels of actually talking about, like, is this the, you know, Umayyad period or the Abbasid period, and so on. And I think part of why it's useful to use both at the same time is that we're really, in a lot of ways, as Islamic archaeologists, talking simultaneously about two different kinds of evidence. On the one hand, as archaeologists, we're really limited to basically the garbage that we're digging up and bringing out of the ground, the stuff that was discarded and thrown away, or lost to disasters or sites collapsing or things like that we find at sites. And Don was right to point out that that doesn't change very cleanly when you transition between different dynasties. And some of it does, like if we find coins, you know, the coins are minted at a very specific period. They kind of change based on who the ruler is and who has the right to mint coins. But other stuff like pottery becomes actually a bit of an issue in the Islamic periods. Famously, in the Middle Islamic period, much of our evidence comes from handmade pottery that, as far as anybody can tell, it changes over the course of 400 or 500 years, but it doesn't change as much as we would like it to, and it doesn't change in ways that we've totally figured out yet. I mean, the distinction between Ayoubid handmade pottery and early Mamluk handmade pottery, who knows? That's sort of anybody's guess. And Don, I think it initially based this idea on work that Bill Adams had done as part of the Nubian Monuments campaign, looking at pottery basically in Nubia, in sort of very southern Egypt and northern Sudan, where he had found that there's some correlation maybe between pottery and dynastic changes, but it's not immediate. There's often a lag time of maybe even up to a couple of 100 years, in some cases, usually probably not that much, but between something interesting happening politically or culturally and something interesting happening that changes the material culture. In Jordan, we also have kind of an interesting secondary effect in terms of the material culture we're finding, where another thing that Adams noticed was that pottery typologies tend to change a lot faster closer to pottery production sites, and they change a lot slower farther away, which makes some intuitive sense if you think about it. If pottery is arriving at sites farther away by trade, everybody in the city where the pottery is being produced is going to get the new fancy stuff really quickly, but it's going to take, you know, months and months, maybe even years for that to reach other places. During the Middle Islamic period in southern Jordan, we find that for the pottery that we really kind of like, the pottery that's really easy to date, in the case of Naqib al-Saymar in particular, that is primarily underglaze painted stone paste, which is a sort of weird glass-based ceramic fabric, probably from Damascus. And A guy who is at the University of Toronto and the Royal Ontario Museum, Rob Mason, did a study of this pottery in Syria. There have been a couple of other people, Christina Tongini, who also worked on some Crusader material in southern Jordan and so on. But Mason's typology from the Syrian sites doesn't exactly match what we have in southern Jordan. The stuff that shows up at places like Moira, Petra, basically Crusader period. So we should be finding material that's basically mid to late 12th century. All of the Syrian ceramics, and they don't have very many, actually are kind of earlier than that. They're like late 11th, early 12th century. And in Feynan, we have some material that in Jerusalem was dated to the early 13th century, but Mason pushed it back to kind of the middle to late 12th century. But in Feynan, we also have it in the early 13th century. And so it kind of seems like even just using these archaeological typologies, we have to take into account these lag times as well, that sometimes a quarter century or a half century of difference between the material culture in the place it's actually produced and when we find it in southern Jordan. But on the other hand, there's some use to actually using those dynastic chronologies. So like, calling this type of pottery Ayoubid might be kind of misleading if actually it's sort of produced in, the Zengid period in Damascus. But I think calling the Qibla Samar an Ayoubid site might at the same time be kind of useful because it sort of stresses that it does really seem to be associated with this particular political moment lasting from about 1187, 1188 until in Jordan 1263 or so, and that we don't have anything that indicates really any other occupation at the sites. I think if you look at Bethany's work, you kind of get the same impression when she's talking about survey material. A lot of the time she'll use Middle Islamic or late Islamic, but talking about a specific documented historical event at Hispan, we might use Mamluk or even specify beyond that because the historical sources kind of make it clear.
Sure.
So sort of the same thing for us.
Why do you think that the economic importance of Jordan, or to be more specific, of the territory of modern Jordan and territory of the south and central Jordan became more important from 12th century until 15th century and the Ottoman occupation of 1517 when they took over the whole Levant? And why Feynan wasn't so important during the Ottoman period?
Right. That's actually a really good question.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, it actually seems that the sort of revival of southern Jordan's importance, it kind of, I don't want to say we owe it to the Crusaders, but it sort of seems to start in that period.
Yeah. It coincides with the period of Crusades.
Yeah, and if we look a little bit earlier than that, in the early Islamic periods, kind of the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries, we see the really southernmost part of Jordan actually becoming really popular. Like Ayla, modern Aqaba, is really important, and there's kind of an agricultural and industrial hinterland that supports that city. And for whatever reason, that trade kind of seems to start becoming less and less important as you get past the 10th century. And of course, there's a devastating earthquake in the 11th century. Politics becomes a little bit complicated in the 11th century. And Ayla is kind of not very important by the time the Crusaders arrive. Of course, much of the area around Feynan had not been that important even before that. We have evidence in some sense of 11th century, 10th century settlements. But after the Byzantine state sort of withdrew from that area, we don't see a lot of very major settlements. We don't see a lot of trade that seems to pass through the central and northern parts of Wadi Araba. It's really kind of Humaima on down that becomes really popular, really important in the early Islamic period. But the Crusaders set up that series of fortresses on the plateau, basically extending from, well, arguably from Amman down to Kerak, and then we have a bunch in southern Jordan. Tafila, one that might be at Sela, we're not sure about that, a couple in Petra, and one just south of Aqaba on Jazirat Faroun. And that becomes kind of a problem for, basically initially for the Seljuks and Zengids. Trying to maintain the Hajj is kind of difficult if the Crusaders basically have fortresses set up all along the Hajj route. And that seems to have been kind of their primary motivation. To some extent, the Hajj routes were also important for trade going north to south, and there's a little bit of predation on that trade by the Crusaders. Even occasionally predation on the Hajj trade. It's arguably trying to get that route back that really motivates Salahuddin and the Ayyubids to kind of reconquer that territory specifically, and to set up pretty major settlements at a lot of those former Crusader sites. So Kerak, of course, becomes a really important site in the Ayyubid period. Kerak is actually the center of basically Ayyubid administration in Jordan. But also Shobuk becomes pretty important in the Ayyubid period. Shobuk kind of becomes the secondary Jordanian center after Kerak. It's sort of, in sources, we kind of often see those two castles being linked, and Shobuk often becomes sort of a treasury area. Why Feynan becomes important in that period, of course, seems to be copper primarily for sugar production. But I think to understand why Feynan doesn't retain that importance, we have to look a little bit at the specifics of how the administration of Jordan actually worked during the Ayyubid period and how that changed into the Mamluk period. Because actually that's really where we see Feynan losing its importance. It's kind of odd, as you're probably aware, I'm sure you've seen a lot of the Italian researchers talk about this. Shobuk retains its importance into the Mamluk period. Shobuk is very important Mamluk site, as is Kerak, even though they're not quite as important as they were in the Ayyubid period. But Feynan, right around that mid-13th century point, based on radiocarbon evidence, based on coin evidence, based on ceramic evidence, it seems like the copper production stops, and we get some small-scale residential settlements around Khirbet Feynan, the southern copper production sites. But we actually excavated, me and Mohammed Najjar and Tom Levy, a slag mound at that site, and it stops in the 13th century. There's evidence for Mamluk settlements around the site, but no evidence for copper production. And I think, for me at least, and this is really the arguments that I made in my dissertation and that I'm making in a couple of papers that hopefully we should have coming out pretty soon.
I'm looking forward to publishing articles about your upcoming papers and your upcoming books and other works. It will be
I'll definitely send you a copy
of our collaboration from 2017, and I always keep an eye on my contacts like yourself, and I read your papers regularly. This is why I came with all these questions.
Right, yeah. And yeah, this is
what
kind
you
of
guys are doing.
That's true.
Even though we haven't seen each other for a while, but I'm in general interested in what my contacts are publishing and how far the research came, and what kind of update and what kind of new information we can disseminate together. You through academic papers, and I'm doing that through the mainstream media, so to say.
Yeah, and this is kind of the I don't know, I guess like a sneak preview of what the next paper will say. Basically, if you look at the Ayyubid period in Jordan, right around, I mean, at some point in the early 13th century, and then toward what we might think of as the mid 13th century, you see something kind of weird happen. So the Ayyubid government works in a way that I think historians have sort of had an easier time dealing with than archaeologists. Archaeologists like to see, like, okay, you've got your state government, it's over there. You've got your local governments, they're over there. The local governments get their, directions from the state government. And so the Ayyubids, the state is based in Cairo and Damascus. They're telling Kerak what to do. It's not exactly how it works, though. In the Ayyubid governments, Cairo and Damascus tend to alternately be where the head of the dynasty is based. And so we can consider those to be kind of the capitals in a sense. But the regional capitals, the places like Kerak, aren't exactly administered by that state government. They're basically put under the control of a kind of, I would say, lesser member of the Ayyubid family, but that's not even necessarily the case. Usually the more important centers are under the control of somebody who has a claim to being important in the dynasty, who might at some point make the claim that they are the head of the dynasty, but who's not quite there yet. And so you have all of these like princes in places like Kerak
up and coming stars and princes who were sent to Kerak as a punishment.
Yeah, exactly.
As a way to prove themselves working on the frontier.
Yeah, well, and so in the Mamluk period, it really becomes a place of punishments. In the Ayyubid period, it's actually a pretty sweet gig. And part of why it's a pretty sweet gig is that unlike in the Mamluk period, where these sort of governorships are revocable by the Sultan, they can kind of pull it away if they want to, if you're doing something they don't like. In the Ayyubid period, that's not strictly true. When you're given these places, they, to some extent, become estates. And so you kind of control them. We actually have evidence in some Ayyubid written sources where the Sultan gets really mad at somebody and says, like, that's it. I need you to give me your holdings back. I need your iqta back. And that person responds with, but if I gave this to you, where would I live? And everybody else in the family goes, oh yeah, he's got a good point. It's like, where would he live? You can't take it away from him. And so the Sultan kind of ends up being powerless. And in the 13th century, there are a couple of times where this sort of goes to an extreme, and Kerak actually starts to become semi-autonomous. It's basically governing itself without very much input at all from Damascus or Cairo. And Cairo and Damascus kind of realize that it's not that they don't want to exercise control over Kerak, they lack the authority and also the force of any military strength that would allow them to do it. And I think part of why Feynan becomes perhaps somewhat important is, if you think about the way copper is entering Jordan, there are basically two ways that's going to happen. There is only one major source of copper in the entirety of the southern Levant, and that's pretty much in Feynan. If you look on the other side of the Araba in the Timna Valley, you've got kind of a minor deposit. It separates over a couple million years because the Araba kind of moves that way. But there's not a lot there. The only big deposit is in Feynan. And other than that, you have to import it. So you could import it from places like Oman, but production there is not as big as it was previously, and the Indian Ocean trade is not as big as it was previously. You could import it from perhaps South Sinai, but we don't really have any evidence that those mines were active. And then beyond that, you're kind of looking at this overseas Mediterranean trade. You could get it from Cyprus, but again, we actually don't have any evidence that the mines on Cyprus were active during that period. Actually, most Cypriot archaeologists would say that there just doesn't seem to be any medieval production from those mines except to get copper salts actually for like medical uses. And so then you're looking at getting it from Europe. And that actually is what the Mamluks end up doing. A lot of copper ends up being imported into Alexandria. Actually, Makrizi in sort of the later Mamluk period starts to blame any problems with the Egyptian economy on the fact that they've imported so much copper and exported all of their silver. But we can kind of ignore that for now because we're a little bit earlier. But if you're in Kerak, that kind of poses a problem if you're trying to exert your independence from Cairo and Damascus. If you're going to get copper, your options are import it, probably through Cairo or Damascus, or make friends with the Crusaders. That's probably not going to be any easier. Or just find a source of your own. And so they did. And I think the reason that Feynan becomes less important after that is when Jordan in 1263 comes under the control of the Mamluk states. The Mamluks, although this is, a long process, it takes maybe a century. One of the first things that happens, though, is the governor of Kerak, so the Prince of Kerak is assassinated. That's kind of a political scandal, and we see that in the narrative sources of the time. Basically, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars says, "Hey, will you meet me for a meeting?" And then he has him killed along the way. Which is, I guess, a lesson for all of us. If somebody's mad at you, maybe don't leave your house to meet them for a meeting. But Kerak is put under the control of a Mamluk governor, actually, I think Baybar's sons initially, who are a little bit less interested in autonomy. There's some attempts, but it doesn't really work. But even if more copper was needed to continue expanding the sugar industry for repairs, just for, the kinds of things you would need copper for also, there aren't any places in Jordan where coins are being minted, but certainly in Kerak, in Shobak, items are being made of copper, tea kettles, or not tea kettles, but kettles and things like that. If you're the Mamluks, though, you can just rely on European copper that you've been importing. You're not really worried about having your economic autonomy and not having to rely on someone else. And so I think Feynan kind of ends up fading in importance for that reason, even as Shobak and Kerak, as you point out, remain very important. Even into the Ottoman period, and both places into the Ottoman period, we actually see like local resistance to the Ottomans kind of being exerted by very powerful rulers of these places. But yeah, Feynan just kind of loses its economic importance, and actually at the end of the 13th century, the British team from the CBRL found what might be very limited evidence for somebody in the Ottoman period coming in and maybe doing some experiments to see if they could continue producing copper there. There's no slag mound or anything. There's just a radiocarbon date from the top of a much earlier slag mound that seems to be in the Ottoman period. But beyond that, yeah, the 13th century is the last episode of copper production in Feynan. Actually, as you know, because you've been there, the main activity now is really growing tomatoes and watermelons and things like that.
They're into agriculture like the rest of Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea area, or southern tip of the Dead Sea, meaning Gor Safi and Gor Fifa, and all these places that are around Lot's Cave and before Wadi Araba. But what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think about Mamluk state? Was Mamluk state centralized enough to control all these provinces? How centralized was the state of Mamluks?
That's a good question too, and I think it's one of those questions that it would sort of have slightly different answers depending on the specific period you're looking at. A couple of years ago, a guy named William Winslow Clifford, who unfortunately actually very tragically died after completing his dissertation, and his advisor edited that dissertation into a book, made the argument that basically the mid-13th century, so the period after Baybar's ascent to power, kind of talking like sort of that third quarter of the 13th century and beyond. His argument was that we should really view that as a period of state formation in the way that archaeologists often talk about state formation, that what we were looking at was a transition from, he kind of relied on this very like 1960s archaeological theory that sort of has this, you know, neo-evolutionary framework trying to fit different societies into different molds. But his argument was basically, if we look at the Ayyubids, what they are is more or less what anthropologists in the 60s and 70s called a chiefdom. Clifford instead called it a chieftaincy, but it's kind of clear what he means. And that we see the formation of a secondary state in the early Mamluk period. It's not an immediate process. There are actually a lot of reforms at the beginning of the 14th century that contribute to this. But I read that book and I think he has a really good point, actually, that we do, within just a couple of generations, see the Mamluk states integrate a lot of former Ayyubid and also former Crusader holdings in a way that is actually much more centralized. And part of the way that they do that, well, through a number of reasons, Clifford's argument is that it has something to do with the distinction in how Mamluk rulership was actually conceived versus Ayyubid rulership. Basically that because Mamluk rulers essentially rose through the ranks of Mamluks, what's usually translated into English as something like slave soldiers.
Slave soldiers, yeah.
There was some sort of solidarity between the ruler and the military that actually led to a sort of greater centralization of power. And another argument is that a lot of the administrative changes were geared toward giving governors a lot less power than they had had in the Ayyubid period. And during that early period, we kind of see there's a pretty slow transition. So Kerak is integrated into the Mamluk state in 1263. In some ways, that's actually kind of early and really, I think, derives from the fact that the last Ayyubid ruler of Kerak, Al-Mu'arrikh Omar, was just sort of hostile to the Mamluk states, was not really a fan of Baybar's. Actually, there's some pretty good evidence that Al-Mu'arrikh Omar was siding with the Mongols against the Mamluks when Baybar's fought at the Battle of Ain Jalut. That probably was part of why Baybar's was not a huge fan of him. And so that kind of comes in early, but there are a lot of other former Ayyubid principalities, these former emirates, where if the princes kind of agreed to play nice and to let the Mamluks have the final say, they let those Ayyubid rulers stay as the governors of those places until they died, and then they were integrated into the Mamluk state. So we even have like sources actually written by people who were Ayyubid governors but living in the Mamluk period, like Abul Fida's diary is basically the diary of somebody who was one of those rulers. But I think the Mamluks actually end up doing a pretty good job of centralizing things through this sort of system of making these former estates, these iqta'at, basically the like broken up divisions where people collect taxes, taking away any semblance of them actually looking like estates as we would think of them, looking like places that you grant to somebody as a place that they can live at and pass down to their children. It becomes entirely an administrative thing. If you're granted a place as an iqta, you get some control and some governorship over it, but actually what you're mostly granted is the right to collect taxes from the people living there. And so you can kind of tell them, like, I want to collect a lot of taxes from you, so you need to grow something that is lucrative for me. That's why sugar continues to be important and expand, is, you know, basically every place you could grow sugar, if you're the muqta of a place, you say, grow sugar, that sells for a lot of money. Like, don't grow this stuff that, you know, you're going to eat yourself. I don't care about that.
Maybe the reason for centralization during Mamluk period was, in fact, that they were outsiders, non-Arabs. And in order to preserve themselves in order not to be eaten alive by local feudalists and local aristocracy. They try to keep control of different economical aspects of the previous state, previous systems, and to keep well-known families, well-known local aristocrats at the track by favoring them and punishing them. It was like a policy. It was a policy of carrot and stick in a way. If we talk about carrot and stick from 12th, 13th century. No, yeah, it's 13th, 14th, 15th century carrot and stick policy.
Yeah, I think that argument has certainly been made that a lot of what the Mamluks end up doing, to some extent, does relate a little bit to this tension about their legitimacy, because you're right, they're people coming in from the outside. I mean, that's the whole point of the Mamluk system, is that these were soldiers who were being brought from places generally in Central Asia. They weren't, people who were basically being captured from the local population, which kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And actually, I think a lot of people, even, in the early 20th century, a lot of scholars that we would now call Orientalists had sort of proposed that specific aspects of the Mamluk state, stuff that we all kind of know about but don't talk as much anymore, like the fact that the Mamluks basically claim to have rescued and or kidnapped the caliph from Baghdad when the Mongols advanced and taken him to Cairo, and they basically maintain a caliphate in Cairo of this person's ancestors, probably relates to the fact that grants some religious legitimacy that converts coming in from Central Asia might not have otherwise had. And I think a lot of people have also pointed out that when you look at, Mamluk architectural patronage or patronage of things like the Hajj routes, a lot of that is geared toward establishing religious institutions that might, again, work in kind of the same way. You brought up sort of these local important families, and I think it's something that's often overlooked, maybe in part because it occupies a really hard area for us to get at as scholars, but actually a lot of archaeologists and historians have pointed this out, that local people in Jordan actually played a kind of surprising role in the politics of the Mamluk period. So you mentioned that during the Mamluk period, princes who you kind of want to keep an eye on, or rather you want somebody else to keep an eye on, you exile to places like Kerak.
They would ostracize them to Kerak, for instance, to remove them from the court in Cairo or the court in Damascus.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of Siberia of Mamluk state, roughly speaking.
And then, I think you can sort of see a shift in the strategies that some of these local people use in response to that between the Ayyubid and Mamluk states. I think, although we don't have great evidence of this, that part of the autonomy of places like Kerak in the Ayyubid period probably had something to do with the role of local people, and especially local important families, in trying to sort of encourage that type of autonomy and actually giving maybe local people more of a say in what's going on. In the Mamluk period, we actually have examples of somebody who had a claim to being sultan being exiled to Kerak, and then the Kerakis basically bringing them back to Cairo and saying, we want this guy to be sultan, and the people kind of just giving into the angry mob, basically saying okay, fine, yeah, you can have that guy as sultan. And I think you're right that part of the logic of that probably has to do with the recognition that having a friendly sultan, somebody who's actually sort of taking the interests of people in places like Kerak into account, would have been a good thing. And maybe it would have been good to have kind of an ally against the Muqtaz. As Bethany Walker has pointed out, those relationships actually seem to have generally been pretty good. We don't see a lot of conflict between local sort of agricultural villagers and the governors and muktaz. And where it is, it usually has something to do with either the local governors trying to basically extort those populations or mismanage something. And usually the sultan actually fixed it. Usually that wasn't a situation that was allowed to continue. And it might be that the success, especially in the early period of that centralization, maybe does have something to do with the fact that the Mamluks are acutely aware of the kind of fine line they're walking and needed to ensure pretty good
And they had
management
to
of these
balance
areas. Yeah, I think there's
their
really
own
something to be said
interests
for
and
that.
interests of the local autonomous regions led by local dignitaries, which is a bit different of what we have in the Ottoman Empire with the Janissary court. If you follow what Janissaries were within the Ottoman Empire and how they operated in 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, when most of Janissaries were former Christians converted to Islam, and they formed the Praetorian Guard of Ottoman sultans. And later on, when ranks of Janissaries became so popular, Muslims were allowed, and corruption emerged. So ordinary people, Muslims or Christians, would bribe Ottoman administrators, Ottoman bureaucrats who would go and recruit children for the Janissary court. And of course, after a few centuries of corruption, they became the problem for the Ottoman Sultan, who abolished them in early 19th century. But Janissary court was a very important factor within the Ottoman Empire. I wouldn't say they were state within the state, because Ottoman sultans were smart enough to contain them, and they never allowed them to take the role that Mamluks and Seljuk Turks took during different Muslim states, not only in Levant but in Baghdad. They came as slave soldiers, and later on they took over the whole state and the whole empire, becoming de facto rulers of these states. So
Yeah, I mean, it's actually the really interesting thing about the Ayoubid-Mamluk transition, right? Is that it's
true.
precisely that. The Mamluk cores have just become so powerful. I mean, Baybars had actually been a Mamluk to the Ayyubids,
Yes,
and then later became the ruler of that state.
he toppled them.
Yeah, you don't see that.
He toppled
Let's
them
take it.
directly. I said he toppled the Ayyubids, and he formed a new dynasty with his moves against Ayyubids. So Ottomans
Yeah.
avoided that, and normally the major position that any Janissary would take was the position of the Grand Vizier. They were not allowed to have families. They were not allowed to have children before they became the mainstream core, and before they allowed them to form families, which led to the decline of the Janissary order and, of course, the empire. It went hand in hand. When they were isolated from family life, where they were loyal only to Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, they were more contained and more useful for the empire. Once they started to exercise ordinary behaviors, they became the burden, and this is what happened. And if you study the history of Grand Viziers and Janissaries, you realize that in 14th, 15th centuries, most of them were from the Balkans. most of them were Serbs, Albanians, converted Greeks, converted Armenians. In general, they were converts by the definition. It's a similar concept to Mamluks, but a little bit modified, because probably Ottoman Turks tried to learn from mistakes of their predecessors, and they didn't want to end up run by Janissaries. Regarding Feynan, I have also a couple of other questions. What do you think about
Okay.
mold-made oil lamps, the wares that your team found in Wadi Feynan?
Yeah, those are actually another one of those categories of artifact that I don't know why this is the case, but for whatever reason, those almost do seem to change almost in association with dynastic changes. Yeah, actually, in some ways, those are some of the most diagnostic artifacts that we found in Feynan, other than the imported, wheel-made glazed pottery. And there are basically two types of those lamps, as far as we can tell. They're really kind of the continuity, and in some ways, I think probably among the last examples of this tradition of mold-made lamps in Jordan. We see mold-made lamps really appearing as early as the Hellenistic periods,
Yeah.
and they kind of continue. I mean, obviously, we have these very beautiful early Islamic versions that are like quite highly decorated. They've got, grapes and vines and all kinds of stuff scrolling through them. And the ones we find in Feynan they seem to just kind of be an evolution of that type. They're sort of the continuity of this very long tradition of people in the southern Levant making these mold-made lamps, kind of in what you might almost call like a late Byzantine-derived style. And there are two varieties of the type that we find in Feynan. One is the type that we actually find in Feynan, so it's usually called something like a high tongue-handled lamp. And that's actually the big distinction between these two types of lamps. The early one seems to emerge sometime in the late 12th century, maybe the very beginning of the 13th century, and continue through to about like 1250, 1260. Has this, it's an almond-shaped body with a handle that just kind of comes up like that. It's like just a little hook at the back. And it's decorated in a variety of ways, but those early lamps seem to have a pretty limited range of things. They've usually got some kind of vine motif. They often have an Arabic inscription that says something like prosperity to the owner of this lamp, prosperity forever, and I forget what the other part is. Or they have this sort of weird just spiral motif of basically like somebody drew a line starting from the center and just went out in a spiral a couple of times over the lamp. In the mid 13th century, and you can see this change happening over time, the handle starts to get lower and lower and eventually just touches the body. The later examples, it's really just kind of like smushed down into the body. It almost doesn't really function that well as a handle anymore by the end of the production of this lamp. And the motifs change a little bit too. So you get this sort of herringbone motif of just lines kind of like that. You get some things that look like Arabic inscriptions, but they're not. They're called pseudo inscriptions. They just don't say anything. Usually it's just like, it looks like an aleph and lam next to each other, and then there's nothing, and then there's an aleph and lam again, like they just wrote the all over the lamp. And there are a couple of other designs. There's one that's, I think Marcus Milwright called it the spiral galaxy design, and it's just kind of a spiral shape. But they're oddly diagnostic. The high tongue-handled lamps seem to emerge not very long into the Ayoubid period, maybe by the late 12th century, and they don't last even throughout the Ayoubid period. They are as far as we can tell, I right now would consider them one of the diagnostic markers of the shift between what at Hispan, Bethany Walker and Stan LaBianca called the Middle Islamic 2A and 2B. And I would say you find those high tongue-handled lamps in Middle Islamic 2A. They're basically diagnostic of that period archaeologically, even if we can't quite fit that into a dynastic period yet. And the 2B through C is really diagnostic of the attached handle or low handle lamps. And it's really rare that we find pottery made in the southern Levant that is that precisely diagnostic, in part because the wheel-made ware is made in places like Jerusalem and Kerak and Shobak we don't have a great handle on yet. There are a couple people working on getting a better sense of that chronology, but the lamps are pretty solid. There's been some work recently that sort of questions whether that typology is valid, but I think so far at every site where we see these lamps, that is the typology. In Feynan, we only get the early 13th century type. We have a couple of sherds of the late type, which probably tells us at this site we have occupation continuing a little after 1250. This change probably didn't happen exactly when the Mamluks took power, but a little bit before. At Hispan, you see kind of the same thing. You get those later lamps in very small quantities in the like later Ayoubid, transitional Ayoubid-Mamluk phases, but in the Mamluk phases, all you get are the late type. It seems to be a really good indicator of that. And then, of course, later in the Mamluk period, we start to mostly see kind of a return to those like folded wheel-made lamps that we see even in the Iron Age in Jordan, but they're glazed. And so kind of a lot fancier than the Iron Age versions, but they're sort of just open lamps as compared to the different mold-made closed types, and those become a lot more popular.
I have one last question about a well-known Egyptian historian, Al-Makrizi, who lived between 1364 and 1442. And he covered the role of production of copper coins in Wadi Feynan, and he wrote about the relationship between copper production or coin production in from Wadi Feynan and Mamluk economy. How Mamluk economy was affected by coins from Wadi Feynan.
So this is kind of a weird thing. Strictly speaking, Makrizi doesn't actually talk about Feynan, and this was something that in the book Archaeology and Desertification, which was the big publication of the British Wadi Feynan survey, there's some pretty, I would say there's good evidence for settlement in Feynan in the Mamluk period. There are a handful of 14th century coins. There are some difficult to interpret radiocarbon dates from some contexts that aren't really archaeological. They're like water features and things like that. And on our project, we didn't find any Mamluk pottery during excavations, but in surface walking of the site, we found a handful of sherds that are either very, very late Ayoubid or early Mamluk period. They're most likely 14th century. So there seems to be settlements in Feynan. And the British team took this line, actually took a couple of lines from Al-Makrizi's work, which has been translated into English by Adel Alouche as it's a book called Mamluk Economics, which is pretty cool. And what Makrizi talks about is at a certain point in the Mamluk period, the currency starts to be heavily biased toward copper currency, according to Makrizi. Previously, economic historians actually referred to this as an age of copper. It's kind of a misnomer, but we'll kind of leave it at that. And what Makrizi said, and actually what he attributed this to, was basically, Makrizi says, okay, there's this guy who is in charge of the mints in Egypt. And he is corrupt. And so basically what he does is he exports a lot of Egyptian silver to Europe, because Europe is also facing kind of a silver shortage at this time and needs silver. And they could get a ton of copper very cheap. And so basically just starts to ramp up production of copper currency quite a lot. At the same time, you start to see changes in the weights of copper coins. And actually there's maybe some indication that the weights of copper coins not only are standardized, but also do become a little bit heavier during this period. And there's a lot of economic history behind this where, like, okay, you have to kind of consider how exchange actually works. So copper coins work a little bit like the currency that we use now in Mamluk Egypt. Basically, they
You mean the
were
printed money?
exchanged.
You mean
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So whoever owns the printer can print as much money as they want. This is the problem in modern economy. But of course,
Well,
I'm
and
not
there's that.
competent to talk about economy. This is one of claims.
But I guess the difference is it works. There's a strange conversion. So like gold and silver currency are exchanged by weight. And so, you know, you can even, I mean, we see examples of this actually. You can like cut pieces off of your gold coins and like give someone just a little bit of it and say like, I'm just giving you this much gold. You don't need the whole coin. But copper is exchanged, economic historians usually say by tale. And so you just say, this is an actual copper coin. Look, you know, it's got this stamp that tells me it was minted by this ruler. It's worth this much. Basically the way that, you know, you go into a store today and you say, you know, ask how much it is. It's 5 JD. You give them a 5 JD note and nobody like weighs the paper to say like, did you just write 5 on a 1 JD? Like nobody cares about that. But because there are these two systems of currency, if say you're a baker, and a baker is actually the example that Warren Schultz, who's also an economic historian, uses to kind of demonstrate this, bread is not worth very much money. And so most of the people coming in and buying bread from you are not going to be giving you silver or gold. They're going to be giving you copper coins. And that kind of makes sense. But if you're paying your taxes or you're trying to buy something relatively big, you can't just walk in with like a huge sack of copper money and say like, yeah, this is this much, because nobody's going to go through and count, you know, exactly how many copper coins you have. And so there's a way of exchanging it where you basically have an exchange of copper coins by weights for gold or silver coins. It's almost like, I don't know if this happens in Jordan, but here in the US, we have recycling centers where you basically take in like just a ton of like aluminum cans and they will exchange those aluminum cans for money. It's pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, we do
yeah.
have centers.
Okay, perfect.
If you go around any city, you'll find those guys collecting used cans of Coca-Cola, cans of Pepsi or 7-Up, and they get reimbursed for as much trash they bring to the station.
Yeah, that it's basically the same thing, but for coins, and actually some of the same like tricks that you can imagine are reported in Al Makrizi. So I think he at some point talks about, you know, like there was someone trying to exchange this copper for gold, and it turns out they had mixed like a bunch of nails and stuff into the bucket to increase the weight. But the point is, at some points, the value of the copper coins increases relative to the silver and gold currency. And the reason that we know this has to be the case is that the weight of the copper coins goes up. And if you think about how the system works, basically, if you increase how much copper is in every coin that you're saying is still worth the same amount, it's still worth one, you know, one fills basically, whether or not it's heavier. You have to have fewer of them to exchange, assuming the same exchange rate for some amount of silver. And so at some point that happens where the weight of the coins goes up. And the British researchers initially kind of took this to mean that there must have been some additional source of copper that allowed them to add this extra weight to the coins. From the perspective of economic history, I think they've actually got this slightly wrong. In my perspective, what that probably means is that copper actually becomes a little bit more scarce, because if there's a ton of copper and it's worth basically nothing, you don't really need those copper coins to be worth as much silver or gold. You actually kind of reduce their value. Whereas if you increase their value with relation to silver, you're kind of saying, okay, copper actually is more valuable. But it's kind of a complicated thing. But they sort of use that to say that additional source of copper must have been Feynan. The issue is that we just don't have evidence for this in a couple of ways. I mean, we don't have any evidence that any copper was produced in Feynan in the Mamluk period, but we certainly, even if we're going to argue that okay, maybe there's some minor production, like there's no production in this period at Nakib al-Samer, which is the biggest production site in Feynan in this period, and our team, the what are we called, the Edom Lowlands Regional Archaeology Project, excavated the larger of the two slag mounds attributed to the Middle Islamic period at Khirbet Feynan. We didn't totally excavate it, but we put a probe in and found that that production is also limited to the Ayyubid period. If you start to argue like, okay, maybe only part of that mound was in use, maybe it was the smaller slag mound across the Wadi that was in use, we're starting to talk about very, very low quantities of copper that are possibly produced during this period in Feynan. Whether that's enough to actually have a major impact, not only on the Egyptian economy, but on the way that Egyptian coinage is minted, seems pretty unlikely, given that even according to Al-Makrizi, the majority of the copper that's coming into Egypt is actually coming from Europe. And that seems more likely, that the primary source of copper for Egypt during this period was trade with Egypt, or so trade with Europe, because Europe had, of course, become the primary copper producer in this period anyway. And so I think that's kind of the connection. It was an interesting connection, and I think in a period when we hadn't excavated any of these sites in Feynan and were working entirely on survey data, that suggestion did make some sense. But our excavations have kind of shown there doesn't seem to be much to it, in part just because there actually doesn't seem to have been any active production in Feynan during Makrizi's lifetime.
Thank you for your answers. I wish you all the best during this pandemic, and hopefully you're going to visit us in Jordan. You're going to continue your researches in not only Wadi Feynan, but in the region. I know what are your plans in coming months. Although it's very difficult to plan anything, but
I was going to say that's the difficulty. So I'm teaching at UC San Diego right now, and a lot of what comes after that really depends on the course of the pandemic. But in terms of my research in Jordan, this summer, inshallah, we have a season planned for doing some initial excavations of the medieval settlements at Khirbet al-Balua on the Karak Plateau, and that's kind of a continuity of my research in Feynan, but really sort of coming into the Karak Plateau and starting to see, okay, at a pretty big village like Balua, do we see any connections to Karak? I think it's kind of an interesting test case in that it's both far away from Karak on the plateau, but a pretty important site to see whether distance from Karak is a bigger deal than what seems to be the size of the sites. And also, at the last ASOR conference, at least the last in-person ASOR conference, I spoke with a couple of people from the Humaima project, in particular, John Olson and Barb Reeves. And I've also talked since then to Rebecca Foote, who directed excavations at Humaima Field F103, the Abbasid family Qasr. And that has been excavated for quite a while. And I was talking to them about when the publication was coming out. And the sticking point is basically nobody has actually read and analyzed the ceramics yet. And so I pitched that as a fellowship for ACOR, and I got John and Rebecca and Barb's approval for that and got the fellowship. Unfortunately, when I was told I got the fellowship was basically the same month that we were told, also, you can't actually take the fellowship because there's a pandemic and you can't
True.
possibly come to Jordan.
Okay, maybe you can use
So
that scholarship later on when pandemic is over.
yeah, and so that's the plan. Whenever travel to Jordan becomes possible, again, hopefully by this summer, I'll be doing that
2021, yeah.
too. So kind of working on some stuff in southern Jordan as well, which is very exciting. It looks like we're going to get all of that published in the next couple of years. Again, inshallah.
Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in Amman. We can sit, talk, brainstorm your project, your research, and of course socialize with our friends who are still based. I'm not going to say stuck in Amman, but they're for some reason based here, and it will be nice to see you in person. Thank you one more time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in Amman soon.
All the best.
Thanks.